All kinds of bizarre creations have made up the story of the automobile for a century and a half. David Burgess Wise wrote in that illustrated encyclopedia of automobiles, "The motor car industry has probably attracted more visionaries and charlatans, optimists and rogues than any other commercial industry." This video is going to focus on the charlatans. The car as a concept was well past its early days by the middle of the 20th century, but in the years just after World War II, when a lot of Europe's factories were destroyed and its cities and infrastructure were smashed, the development of new cars faltered. Some established companies that survived had to rely on pre-war technology. Others actually dusted off designs that were conceived just before the war or while there was still fighting and put them into production. But upstarts had to begin from scratch, and there were a lot of upstarts. People had to get around, and cars were desperately needed. So many cars had been either cannibalized for steel to make weapons or were just destroyed that there was a shortage of civilian transportation. In some countries in the late 1940s, such as in occupied Germany, no new cars had been produced since the start of the war. The most obvious solution with material shortages and lack of money was motorcycles and scooters. But demand for some weather protection led to a proliferation of half-cocked designs that often barely went beyond glorified three-wheeled scooters with some weatherproofing. But there were still plenty of jokers out there looking to make a quick buck by fooling the public. Two cars from Hamburg, Germany, were even more ambitious than the rest and tried to compete with the big automakers. Built in makeshift factories by people with no experience in cars, in the early years just after the war, tried to defy all the odds. They disappeared after only about a year or so, leaving barely a blip in history. This is the story of the Vendox and the Staunau. So Dr. Adolf Alpers ran a small firm called Vendox, so named because it was located on Wendenstrasse in Hamburg, in an old school building. He had about 100 employees building these hand-operated rail carts. They're like the things you see in those old Warner Brothers cartoons. And enclosed rail carriages called dry scenes. They were usually made of a wooden frame with sheet metal body panels hammered onto the frame, riding on steel wheels, and these vehicles were actually used to transport mail and other goods from town to town, since much of Germany's rail network was kept intact by the Allies during occupation. Dr. Alpers' dry scene business boomed since so many were needed due to the shortage of cars. But dry scenes aren't exactly advanced technology. Dr. Alpers' company also began building some motorized tricycles used for deliveries, such as for newspapers or milk. Most were powered by the ILO 200 single cylinder, the same tiny motor in that pre-war Goliath, for example. Building these little delivery trikes got some local attention, and one day, in walked Professor Mobius. Oh yes, some of the names in these stories sound like they came out of comic books. Professor Mobius asked Dr. Alpers, "Hey, can you build me a car?" Dr. Alpers agreed to try, and he went to his engineer named Heinrich Parts, yes, Parts, who designed a four-wheeled car with the single-cylinder ELO driving the right-hand rear wheel by chain. There are no photos of this contraption that I could find, but when they presented Professor Mobius with his new car, he was delighted. And well, this led Dr. Alpers to draw some unfortunate conclusions. You see, he said to Parts, "If what we made is good enough for a professor, then the general public should be easy." They had plenty of experience bending sheet metal, but they ran into trouble when they tried to find an engine. A previous attempt at manufacturing some medium-duty trucks, which Alpers had powered with Volkswagen flat 4 engines that he had acquired on the second-hand market, had landed the company in hot water with Volkswagen, who protested them using VW's name in the advertising, saying they did not sell engines to Vendox, and threatened to sue. So they settled on using an industrial ILO two-stroke engine, which was typically used to power circular saws in sawmills. With 2 cylinders and 398 cc, it made 11.5 horsepower. The car was constructed the same way Alpers had his dry scenes made, by attaching the very nice, though simple, body panels onto a wooden frame. The engine was bolted directly to the frame ahead of the rear axle, and drive was by chain to the right-hand rear wheel. But Alpers and Parts figured no one would notice. It looks like a normal car, doesn't it? So that's good enough. Alpers then hired Henry Bachmann to be his sales agent, and this is where things get ridiculous. By Bachmann's suggestion, the car was named the Wendax Aero WS700. Even though the saw motor was only 400cc, hardly any testing had been done to see if the car was suitable, and as soon as it was finished, Henry Bachmann loaded the car onto their WL1200 flatbed truck that they had built and drove it to the Hanover Export Fair in summer 1949. It got a lot of attention at the fair, including from Das Auto magazine, who wrote, "The small Wendax Aero two-seater with a pontoon body met great interest, although we did not particularly like the rear engine installation." Yeah, I'll bet. Bachmann presented the car at several auto shows and he made big promises. It was priced at 4,700 Deutschmarks, so the Aero WS 700 was more expensive than a standard Volkswagen, which had a 4-cylinder, 1-liter engine and a roof. The white steering wheel on the Roadster was considered to be a classy touch, but when later tested by Das Auto magazine, they were horrified. The car lurched violently to the left under power, forcing the driver to have to constantly countersteer. They wrote, "Keeping the car in the lane, especially on slippery roads, requires above-average driving skills. Not good news in a country dealing with poor roads." But Alpers set about designing his own company logo. He fussed for hours over the stylized W in Vendox. Bachmann talked a good game at the auto shows and brought in dozens of orders. When he returned to Hamburg, he and Dr. Alpers, along with Parts, threw a beer hall-style party to celebrate their success with all the workers. But after all that beer was drank, the hangover quickly followed. Complaints poured in about the cars that had been delivered to customers. After just a few months, their roadsters were already falling apart. Angry customers drove their cars up to the Vendox factory yard demanding repairs. In one case, the throttle and brake pedals had broken off, where the owner found they had been crudely butt-welded to a pipe. In another case, the doors fell off after driving only 2,000 kilometers. It was then found that most Aero WS 700s weighed in at over 800 kilos when the literature claimed 680. In a couple instances, dealers returned the cars to Hamburg demanding refunds, but then Bachmann turned around and resold the repaired cars to other dealers as first-hand cars. But Dr. Alpers was undeterred. He was intrigued by the Borgward-Hansa 1500 that had been parked next to the Vendox at the Hanover Fair, and so asked Parts to design him a big 4-door sedan. The resulting car had a large body made by Carrosserie Bobel, the same firm that had worked with Hans Trippel. With a long aluminum strip along the side, the doors opened French door style, but they had no structural pillars in between. And it was powered by Elo's new U750 engine, which proved to be a mistake. The U750 engine was called a double piston, which is actually a 2-cylinder engine, but it has 2 small cylinders Siamese together, which has these 2 pistons that are attached to the same connecting rod, which is then on the crankshaft. Yeah, the displacement of the engine was supposed to be 746 cc, and it made 25 horsepower, but it was completely untested. The new car was finished in March 1950 with this engine, and they called it the WS 750. Although why they decided at this stage to be honest with the displacement name of the car, I don't know. The Roadster was phased out of production soon after the WS 750 was completed. It was too primitive and had gotten the firm a bad reputation, but the 4-door showed some promise. Instead of crude single chain drive of the Roadster, the sedan used the front-wheel drive coupling designed by Parts for the flatbed pickup truck. Car-hungry dealers were impressed by the large 5-seater body, the column shifter, and the stately front grille, which made them forget all about the problems they had had with the Roadster. And it was priced at 5,750 Deutschmarks, which was in league with Borgwards of the time and 40% more expensive than a standard Volkswagen. Bachmann promised dealers that Wendax would soon be delivering cars within 3 to 4 weeks, and when this didn't happen, he bragged to them that he had orders backlogged of hundreds of cars to Belgium and the Netherlands, which was complete bullshit. To placate one impatient dealer, Bachmann even convinced Alpers to sell him the prototype. As long as they had a working car, Bachmann was gonna sell it. Dr. Alpers now had a workforce of 300 employees, but even with this many builders, they couldn't keep up. Vendox was completing only about one WS750 per week on average, alongside production of the dry scenes. Even so, the money was not rolling in fast enough, and just like before, it wasn't long before the public discovered that the Wendax WS750 was a turd. The wood frame construction meant the car was very heavy, and with just 25 horsepower, the engine was overtaxed. It was found that a flaw in the engine design caused it to shake badly at speeds above 40 miles per hour, which was the typical cruising speed on inner city roads at the time, making the Vendax sedan a noisy rattlebox. Customer complaints poured in about poor body construction, door handles falling off, and the motoring press began to attack Vendax in the papers. The editors of Das Auto magazine were enraged. It takes astonishing courage or bottomless cheek to sell these rubber-wheeled dry scenes as automobiles for 5,000 marks, is what they wrote. Soon after production of the WS750 got going, Dr. Alpers finally decided to trade in his old 1938 Steyr and have a WS750 Roadster made just for himself. It had a body similar to the Aero WS700, but with the front end of the larger sedan, and the ILO 750 engine. And once Henry Bachmann got his hands on it, though, he took it to auto shows, telling prospective customers that Vendax would soon be selling this new convertible too, but he posted assistants to guard the car on the stand, who were instructed never to open the hood under any circumstances. It's said that when someone asked at one of these auto shows if they could, open the hood and have a look at the engine, that the assistant told them he had lost the key. It should be noted that the hood of the car did not open with a key. Alpers and Parts were desperate to find fixes for all the problems. They sought out a different body maker that could craft a better quality shell. Parts found a 1.2-liter Ford engine on the second-hand market and built a test chassis to which he fitted the new shell. But it was too late, as Wendax was now in serious financial trouble. And then the Blendax toothpaste company sued because their names sounded too similar. And that was the end of that. In October 1951, the company was bankrupt, and the bank stepped in to save the dry scene business. The Vendax car brand was never heard of again. After only about 2 years, total production of Wendax cars was just 19 Roadsters and 70 sedans, plus the one WS750 Roadster built specially for Dr. Alpers, making not even 100 cars in total. There is actually one known survivor in a museum in Holland, kept in barn-fresh state as found. The car served as a Hamburg taxi for many years. There's also a few surviving tricycles, those delivery tricycles, which are in a few museums over in either Germany or the Netherlands. I'd love to go have a look at these, but the circumstances we're in with travel and everything has made that impossible for now. In occupied Germany, Karl-Heinz Staunau was one industrialist who managed to escape the war unscathed. He was a wholesaler of industrial goods and owned a factory that made hoists in Hamburg, just outside Hamburg, in hopes of a post-war building boom. But when the boom didn't come quickly enough, he got out of the construction business and in 1949 invented an ice cream machine that worked with these refrigerated tubes where you poured milk on the top end and out the bottom came frozen ice milk. Staunau's ice machine was a hit and actually earned him a bunch of customers, as the starving German people were craving for this ice cream treat, and it earned Karl-Heinz Staunau some contacts in the confectionery business. One of these contacts, a baker, showed him his motorized carriage that he had made for himself, being crippled from the wartime bombings. And this made Staunau realize how much there was a desperate need for cars. The coming boom, he thought, was not going to be in construction, but in automobiles. The baker put Staunau in touch with an engineer who had worked in the aircraft industry during the war named Gerd Krebs. Krebs was looking for work now that the aircraft industry was dead, and Staunau offered him shares in the profits for their car if he could design him one. Krebs was not a car designer, and so first, Staunau insisted on bringing him along to see the baker so they could study his personal voiture. The first design Krebs came up with was a three-wheeler with two seats, sort of exactly like the baker's vehicle, made with bits and pieces he found on the scrap market. But Staunau rejected the idea, saying, "My name won't go on no tricycle." He wanted a car with four wheels, and not only that, but it must be more beautiful than a Volkswagen, he said. He told Krebs, "The Buick is the most beautiful car." And well, if the boss wants a Buick, then... What is that? The body shell was actually designed to be self-supporting. It was a true monocoque, not a wooden frame like the Wendax or a lot of pre-war cars, with body panels hammered on, but this was a true unibody, made of sheet metal welded together, a method common to the aircraft industry, but not autos of the time. The whole concept of a self-supporting unibody was still in its infancy. For power, they drove to our old friends at Elo Werke, which was located in Pinneberg, not far from Hamburg. Elo were happy to sell engines to anyone, such as upstart automakers hoping to make it big, and so they sold Krebs on the virtues of the ILO 400 engine, which had 389 cc and it was a twin-cylinder two-stroke. The air-cooled vertical twin made 13 horsepower, and it was very cheap. The rest of the parts for the car were scavenged off the scrap market. Krebs found a front axle from a pre-war DKW F8, which was a front drive setup, and he used the gearbox from a Volkswagen. He sourced wheels and seats from wherever he could find them, and designed everything on the car so it could be purchased secondhand. He even designed the doors to be symmetrical, so left or right side doors could be made from the same die, which is actually pretty smart. When the manufactured body panels were finished, Krebs and Staunau's laborers were able to put together their first production car, which was named the Staunau K400 in March 1950. The K in the name actually stands for Krebs. The very second car they built was sold to a dealer, while the third was loaded onto a train and taken to auto shows. So you can see how these ventures failed. As soon as they had a working car, they sold it without doing proper testing, without making sure that it was going to work out. They just sold whatever they had. Such was the demand for cars in post-war Europe in 1950. At the auto show in Berlin, the new Staunau impressed the crowds with its American style. Germans were big on anything American back then, perhaps given their experience at the time with the American GIs during the occupation, who brought with them American products, photographs, and music from back home, which lit people's imaginations. Understandable enough, Staunau claimed that his car had attracted the attention of Walter Chrysler, who remarked, "It grins like an American." There's only one problem with this story, because you see, in 1950, Walter Chrysler was dead. Dead for 10 years, in fact. But this claim made it into Der Spiegel, where the tale expanded to include Chrysler executives coming to Staunau's works in Hamburg to discuss a partnership, which was complete bullshit. No such partnership was ever discussed, I can assure you. The name Staunau does not appear even once in any of Chrysler's history. And even if it did, there's a fair chance the Staunau would be a better-known car. And the Staunau is not a well-known car. Not a car anyone really remembers. The Germans have forgotten all about it. Everyone did, not long after it first came out, and there's a very good reason why. Because you see, the Staunau was a terrible car. It was built in a factory by a group of guys who had never built cars before, and it showed. The K400 was over 14 feet long and was powered by a 13 horsepower engine. It weighed 700 kilos, which meant the power to weight ratio was 53 kilos per 1 horsepower. The Volkswagen, which is known to be a slow car, was 29 kilos per 1 horsepower. The little engine could get the car up to a top speed of 92 kilometers per hour, so they claimed, which is 57 miles per hour, but took forever to get there. When reviewing the car, Werner Oswald, writing for Automotive and Sport, noted that the bodywork was wavy and full of dings. A door frame was bent in one photo, and when the hood was lifted, they had to stretch their necks and do a lot of squinting, for the engine bay appeared to be empty. The engine was so tiny, and it was located all the way at the back of the bulkhead, where it protruded into the passenger compartment and forced the pedals to be awkwardly close together and off-center. The DKW axle and longitudinal front drive setup did not really fit properly. Still, people delighted by the style, and Krebs took a bunch of them for a ride at one auto show, where he went up and down some hills. Eager to alleviate concerns that the car was underpowered, he stopped at the bottom of a hill and then gave it the beans and motored up the hill, laughing, and he said, "Well, that will convince them." The Staunau car delighted so many people that some were willing to make concessions. The makers of DKW's axles offered to sell theirs to Staunau for use on the K400. Staunau procured a transverse leaf rear suspension setup and a Herth gearbox. And his car also attracted the attention of some people who were running a new race series called the ADAC, and they invited Staunau to enter his car into a race. He was opposed to the idea at first, understandably, but somehow they convinced him and Krebs to enter the K400 into a race. The race didn't really work out very well. After just a few laps, the Staunau had already failed out because it was found that they had somehow installed the brake calipers upside down. I guess they were able to fix this problem because they finished the race and they actually supposedly won the 750cc class, which makes me think that the Staunau was the only car entered in the 750cc class. In either case, the experience with the race did convince Krebs and Staunau for the need for more power. And so a salesman at ELO convinced Krebs on the new U750 engine. Oh boy. The engine was claimed to have 28 horsepower, and Krebs installed it into the same body shell they were using for the K400. And testing it without a silencer, he claimed to get it up to a top speed of over 120 kilometers per hour. But the noise was so deafening that you could not hold a conversation inside the car. With a silencer attached, it reduced the horsepower by about 3 horsepower, but at least it gave the car much better acceleration and improved the power to weight ratio to 30 kilos per 1 horsepower, which is still behind the Volkswagen, but close. This gave the car a new top speed of a little over 100 kilometers per hour, or maybe 65 miles per hour. But it raised the price to 5,800 Deutschmarks. Orders came in, but the problem at Staunau's factory was the difficulty in getting funding and procuring materials. When the Korean War began, steel suddenly shot up in price and was diverted to help the Allied nations with the war effort, which forced Staunau's production of cars to a halt. His 800 workers had nothing to do for weeks because he was so convinced the car was going to be a hit, he had sold off his ice machine business. Staunau applied for loans from Bonn and Hamburg, but after they saw his modest factory where old men hammered cars together, they launched an audit. It was only a matter of time before owners began having trouble. One brought his car back with the self-supporting hull broken through after just 4,000 kilometers. And the engine was so unsuited for the car that most owners ended up replacing the ELO with either DKW F8 engines, which made sense given the front axle, and one owner of a K750 replaced the awful Elo motor with one from a Volkswagen. Staunau borrowed money, but it was not enough to offset the costs. And so, bad press from various magazines reviewing the cars doomed the venture. In February 1951, Karl-Heinz Staunau was bankrupt and fled to South America to escape the state coming after him over the debts, and just disappeared. The company was liquidated by selling off half-finished Staunaus. The parts and tools were later purchased by a firm in Sweden who planned to restart production there, but nothing ever came of this, and so many years later it was all scrapped. The Staunau was only around for about a year, and in all, production totaled only 64 of the K400 and just 16 K750s. What has become of any of them is unknown, including Karl-Heinz Staunau's interesting convertible. Given the price of steel and the availability of far better and more refined cars, and then the late 50s recession, most likely they were all cut up. It's possible there is a Staunau hiding in a stone shed somewhere in Bavaria. If it's there, I sure hope I can go have a look at it. Like Saab, at around the same time, Gerd Krebs designed an automobile using knowledge of aircraft design with no experience designing cars at all. The aerodynamic style, especially of the rear quarters, was not unlike the Saab 92. It's aerodynamic and doesn't look at all amateurish. Okay, it looks like crap, but it is a noble effort. When I saw one of these for the first time in this picture, it was not at all what I expected. So that is the story of two rare cars from Hamburg. If you know anything more about them, tell me in the comments. It would be especially appreciated if you'd subscribe. I mean, I hope I've earned a subscription from you with this video. Anyway, I hope you have a wonderful day and hope to see you again soon in another video. I'm surprised how much I overheat. Alright. Krebs was not a car designer, so they went to, and well, if the boss wants a Buick, then it's like a photograph that is kind of one of the well-known photographs online. We're just getting stuck. Okay, there it is. So what kind of model actually is this? Get rid of this bubble wrap. Take a look at our first model of the day, which I've probably shown it in the title of the video, so you already know. Cutting my finger. And slicing the tape here. Open up our little bubble wrap. The model is broken because there'd be nothing more tragic and heartbreaking